Jackson, Mississippi declared a water crisis in August that lasted more than 6 weeks, leaving 150,000 people with limited access to the safe drinking and bathing water. New reporting by The Lever has linked how Wall Street is actually at the center of what drove Jackson's water crisis all along. Here to discuss how a credit rating agency's interest rate hikes directly targeted Jackson is Matthew Cunningham-Cook. Welcome, Matthew. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on, Robby.
So tell us more about this. What is the credit rating agency, and how do you figure that they were partly responsible for this?
Yeah, so Moody's is the largest of the three main rating agencies, S&P and Fitch being the other two, and they rate all kinds of debt, and basically to determine the creditworthiness of the particular debt or debtor. They have been always much harsher with municipal debt than with corporate debt or with more complex structured finance debt. And that's been a consistent problem. They've been sued for it many times, and Dodd-Frank mandated that they stop it. But thanks to weak rulemaking at the Obama SEC, they have not stopped it. And so the result is that when you have cities with high poverty rates, that becomes a bigger question for Moody's than the probability of default, the likelihood that a city would actually pay their debts. Because municipal defaults are, unlike corporate defaults, unlike structured finance defaults, much more common. Most of the time in the municipal space that you see defaults, they're hospitals and other types of institutions that don't have unlimited taxing power, like Jackson, Mississippi, and countless municipalities across the country. All of this leads to Jackson's debt being rated at the junk level, which means that their interest rates are more than double the rates paid by the highest rated debt issuers. And that means that the city is not able to refinance old bad debt that they're paying high interest rates for, and they're not able to issue new debt to fix their soaring infrastructure crisis. And that was exactly what the mayor of Jackson campaigned on in 2017, was this big new bond issue to address the city's infrastructure problems.
Well, that sounds like a vicious cycle then. If you're too poor to qualify for a better rating, and then you get higher interest rates, that obviously makes you poorer, or it doesn't make you wealthier. Yeah. And so you would trap the worst off communities in the same kind of in a spiral, actually make them worse off.
Yeah. And again, it's so uncorrelated with the actual likelihood of default. And so that's what really makes it so unfair. So, for example, 80% of the complex financial products that were rated AAA by Moody's and other ratings agencies in the lead up to the financial crisis saw significant losses to the holders of those securities. Whereas Jackson has never been rated AAA, and it's always been rated significantly lower than that, but they've never seen a default. I think the last time there was a default, it was during World War II, and during that period, municipal defaults were far more common than they are now. So that's really kind of at the core of this issue, is that Moody's has one standard for municipal debt and another standard for corporate or structured finance debt, and it is played a major role in the financial crisis by placing crappy deals, that was literally the language they used, with a AAA mark of approval. And then those deals collapsed, even though they were far riskier than they actually were. Meanwhile, municipal debt just isn't that risky at all. And it's really something that I think Americans should be offended about.
So what's the solution here? What needs to happen to get Jackson what it needs to correct the abysmal water situation?
Yeah, I mean, now we're in a much more pressing situation than we were in 2017 or 2018 for sure. And the only quick route is really a large amount of federal investment. I mean, that's one of the things that we talk about in the piece is that the amount of federal funding for water infrastructure projects has gone down markedly since the mid 70s. And it's the only real way to address this crisis now. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that the reason why Jackson's water crisis is so significant is because there's been extreme levels of corporate dumping of things like grease into the system that just wasn't equipped for that level of toxic dumping into the city's water system. And so it's another example that if the EPA had been doing its job, instead of not doing its job, this whole crisis could have been averted to the way that it was. But it just goes to underscore how rotted out that agency has been.
And you alluded to the financial crisis, which has been part of the reason for it. A big part was exactly what you just described, was the ratings agencies, dishonestly rating these things that are laughable in hindsight. And and claiming that, well, if they're if you're not going to come to them, then they can go to they can go to one of the other two agencies. Is there any way that that kind of competition could have benefited Jackson, or they're really stuck with Moody's, or they couldn't get a more favorable rating from one of the others?
I mean, prior to 1975, there were no, Moody's was like an advisory agency. Its ratings had no force of law like they do now, where banks and insurance companies are required to hold a certain portion of their assets in very highly rated securities, and those ratings are determined by the ratings agencies. Before, it was banks had to hold U.S. Treasuries as a backstop. That was what it was like. And insurance companies had to hold U.S. Treasuries or municipal bonds or certificates of deposit. And so this was it's a very interesting history, the development of this designation from the SEC, where ratings agencies have the force of law, was really about allowing banks and insurance companies to prop up the corporate bond market in a totally unprecedented way. So that, to me, I think we should go back to not giving private credit ratings oligopolies the force of law in what they explicitly say time and time again are opinions protected by the First Amendment.
That sounds good to me too, actually. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on, Robby.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.